I was imprisoned for a murder I didn't commit. Back then they had fingerprints, but not mine. A hair, but it wasn't mine. And a neighbor who heard a scream but couldn't say whose it was. 8 years later, the real killer confessed. He signed a statement. He was convicted, but I remained, because the system said there could be no mistake. And for another 10 years, I lived in a cell where every day began with the same scream inside my head. Why am I still here? If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Sandra Kelly. I was 32 years old the morning the police came for me. At that time, I worked at a small hair salon on the south side of Tulsa, Oklahoma, not far from where the traffic lights always blinked yellow and the laundromat across the street kept its neon open sign on even when it wasn't. I rented a back room in a single-story duplex with peeling white paint and a lilac bush that bloomed too early every year. My life was modest, uneventful, but it was mine. I remember that day like a broken tooth. A Sunday morning, thin coffee in a chipped mug, a worn-out bathrobe cinched too tightly around my waist. The knock came slow and firm, knuckles that knew exactly what they were doing. When I opened the door, two men stood there in suits that didn't quite fit their faces. One of them was holding a folder. The other didn't bother with pleasantries. He handed me a paper and told me I was under arrest for the murder of a man I had never met. I thought it was a mistake. I thought they'd apologize once someone higher up realized the error. I thought in some ridiculous part of my brain that I'd be home before lunch. But they didn't joke. They didn't flinch. They cuffed my wrists with the same flat efficiency you'd expect if they were loading groceries. They led me out while the neighbor across the street watered her lawn in curlers and stared. At the station, the room smelled of stale air and dry ink. They processed me like an object, photographed, fingerprinted, labeled. Then came the questions. Where were you on the night of June 4th? Do you know the victim? Did you own a blue jacket? Had you ever been near Ashbury Street? I answered as best I could. I said I was home. I said I was texting my friend Carla that night about a movie we'd both seen. I said I didn't know any man named Paul Mendez. I said I had never even been to that part of town. They didn't seem to care. They wrote things down, nodded to each other, and told me I'd be held until arraignment. The trial came quickly, too quickly. My public defender barely spoke to me outside of the courtroom. She called me Sandra only once. Most of the time, I was just the defendant. They said there was evidence, a partial fingerprint on a stair rail consistent with mine, a hair found on the victim's sweater that was a possible match. A neighbor had heard shouting, and she said she thought it sounded like a woman. They brought in a forensic analyst who used words like reasonable similarity and probable contributor. But nothing was certain, nothing was conclusive. The whole case was built on shadows pretending to be shapes. I sat there in my second-hand dress with a zipper that stuck, watching strangers decide the weight of my existence. I had no money for a private investigator, no family with legal connections. My mother had died when I was 19, and my father had drifted out of my life like smoke. I had only Carla, who testified that she'd been texting me that night, that she'd spoken to me on the phone, but even her word was framed as hearsay and unreliable. They presented a story, not the truth, but a story. They said I had argued with the victim in a grocery store weeks before, even though no surveillance footage confirmed it. They said I had motive, though no one could say what it was. They leaned on the phrase preponderance of circumstantial evidence like it was a safety net. The prosecutor smiled too often. The jury looked tired. And I just sat there, trying not to tremble. My hands felt like someone else's, heavy and useless in my lap. When the verdict came, it wasn't a surprise. Not really. But it still hollowed me out. Guilty, murder in the first degree, life imprisonment. I remember the judge's voice as distant thunder. I remember the gavel falling like a coffin lid. I remember the bailiff's hand on my shoulder as he led me away, and how my knees almost gave out when the door closed behind me. But most of all, I remember the sickening clarity that settled in. They hadn't proved I was guilty. They had only decided I couldn't be innocent, and so I was absorbed into the system, folded into its cold, bureaucratic spine. I stopped being Sandra Kelly. I became inmate number 547863, a name traded for numbers, a life reduced to file folders, timestamps, and stained photographs taped into court records. I couldn't stop thinking about that fingerprint, the one that might be mine. How many people touched that railing? How many had walked that stairwell? I thought of the hair they found, and how easy it would be for something so small, so meaningless, to fall in the wrong place. I thought about the neighbor who thought she heard a woman scream, and how memory plays tricks in the dark. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I learned quickly that screaming got you nowhere inside those walls. Instead, I memorized the color of the ceiling in my cell. I learned the rust pattern on the water pipes. I counted the seconds between guard shifts. I traced the edges of my cot with my fingernail until the metal wore a ridge into my skin. Because that was all I had. A world of stains, shadows, and silence. And the haunting certainty that the truth had never mattered to them in the first place. They told me I had the right to appeal, as if that word, right, still meant anything once the heavy doors closed and the world outside kept moving without me. The ink on my sentencing hadn't even dried before they handed me a thin folder titled Notice of Appeal, full of language that twisted around itself like vines choking sunlight. I was expected to fill it out, as if justice came with instructions. I tried. God knows I tried. I borrowed a pen that didn't work unless I warmed it in my palm first. I sat on the edge of my cot, the metal digging into the backs of my thighs, reading every line aloud in a whisper, like a prayer in a language I never learned. I asked for help. I wrote to my public defender twice, then 3 times. The replies were slow, if they came at all. Mostly I received silence. Appeals, they said, could take years. But time behind bars doesn't feel like time. It feels like sediment, layers of waiting pressed into your bones until you forget the shape of hope. Every day was the same tray of lukewarm food, the same sound of keys jingling just before a door opened, the same fluorescent hum that made the nights feel identical to the days. I began marking the dates on the wall with the stub of a pencil, first with hopeful hands, then with ritualized despair. I imagined the calendar on the outside turning its pages without me, holidays passing in their quiet ceremonies, birthdays forgotten, seasons dissolving into one another. I asked again. I wrote letters to legal aid organizations, to innocence projects, to anyone whose name sounded like a whisper of possibility. I copied addresses from an old prison library book, the spine held together with tape and the pages yellowed by breath and boredom. I mailed them off with trembling fingers, sealing each envelope like it held a part of my soul. Weeks passed, months. I kept my eyes on the slot in the cell door, waiting for something, anything, to fall through. Most days, nothing came. Just the rustle of other people's mail, the shuffle of guards walking by with blank expressions. I started to believe I had become invisible, not just to the system, but to the entire country, as if I had slipped between the lines of a story no one wanted to keep reading. The appeal sat in some dusty corner of a courthouse, I imagined, unopened or delayed or misfiled beneath the weight of more important cases. Cases with headlines, cases with public pressure. I was not one of those. I had no media, no scandal, just a quiet file with my name misspelled once and never corrected. In the meantime, life inside settled into its pattern. I was assigned to laundry duty, pressing uniforms stiff with starch, inhaling the sharp scent of industrial soap. I learned to fold corners just so. I stopped looking in mirrors, though there were few to begin with. When I saw my reflection in the metal of the dryer door, it startled me. My own eyes looked unfamiliar, like they belonged to someone else entirely. I made few friends, not because I didn't want them, but because trust inside those walls was a fragile thing. One wrong word could stretch into rumors, and rumors into trouble. So I kept to myself. I read case law like scripture. I copied it down into notebooks that I guarded like relics. I studied the statutes used against me, cross-referenced them, read footnotes until my vision blurred. That's when the bitterness began to settle. Not just anger, though there was plenty of that, but something deeper, something like erosion, a wearing away of belief. I began to suspect that no one had ever truly read my case, that no one cared whether the evidence was weak or that another name had surfaced years later. I heard whispers in the yard about the man who'd confessed. Some said he was already serving time for another crime. Some said he named me to deflect suspicion from someone else entirely. I didn't know what to believe. I only knew that I was still here, and he was not. Sometimes at night, I replayed the courtroom in my head, the way the judge never looked me in the eye, the way the prosecutor used words like likely and plausible as if they were synonyms for truth. I remembered the juror with the cough, the one who kept glancing at the clock, as if deciding my future was something that interrupted his lunch plans. I wondered if any of them remembered me now, or if I had already become another case number in the archives. There were moments, brief and sharp, when I thought about giving up, when the silence felt like a verdict louder than the one pronounced in court. But then I would find myself back at the books, tracing paragraphs, writing arguments I didn't know who would ever read. I wasn't a lawyer. I wasn't even educated beyond a GED, but I was determined. And in this place, determination was all I had. One afternoon, after nearly 2 years of unanswered letters, a single envelope arrived. It bore the seal of a legal nonprofit, the ink slightly smudged. Inside was a letter, not a promise, but a beginning. They had received my file. They were reviewing the circumstances, no guarantees, no assurances, but a beginning. I held that letter in my hands until my knuckles turned white, not because it said anything miraculous, but because, for the first time in years, someone had written my name correctly, as if I mattered. It was then I realized the appeal process wasn't just legal, it was spiritual. It was a battle against silence, and silence in its most cruel form wasn't the absence of sound, it was the refusal to be seen. And so I wrote back. I wrote with ink that smeared and hands that shook. I wrote with every ounce of myself that still remembered who I was before the gates closed, because somewhere in a file room or a mailbox or a clerk's desk, my name had surfaced again, and that, in this place, was enough to keep breathing. I still remember the exact way the sunlight filtered through the narrow window on the day I heard about it, a strip of golden light cutting across the cement floor, touching the rusted leg of the cot, illuminating the cracks in the paint like veins on old skin. I had been folding laundry when the guard called my name, his voice flat, almost disinterested, as if he were reading off a grocery list and not delivering a tremor that would split my world in two. There had been a confession. That was the word. Whispered, passed along, distorted by time and tone. A confession. Not a mistake, not a doubt, but a clear, undeniable admission. Another man had stood somewhere, maybe in a room like the one where I had once stood, maybe across a metal table under fluorescent lights, and said the words I had been shouting into silence for years. He had done it. He had committed the crime. The floor didn't shift. The walls didn't melt. No celestial chorus sang through the air ducts. The world remained still, stubbornly indifferent. But something inside me recoiled, not in joy, not even in relief, but in something much more fragile, something like grief. The kind of grief that comes when your suffering is suddenly confirmed, when the ghosts you tried to convince others were real finally take form, and everyone looks surprised. The details trickled in slowly. I was not given an official statement, no letter stamped with authority, just a name mentioned by a fellow inmate who worked in the law library, then a clerk who had heard something from her cousin who worked in records, then finally a printout, smuggled under a book, with his testimony from another case, a case where he had nothing left to lose. He was already serving a life sentence. His crimes had mounted like trash in a forgotten alley. This last one, my case, had lingered in the shadows of his conscience, or maybe he was just trying to bargain for leniency elsewhere. I didn't care why he confessed, only that he did. In his statement, he described everything: the location, the weapon, the timeline, things only the true perpetrator could have known, things that had once been brushed off as inconclusive or irrelevant when I tried to explain them in my own defense. Reading his words was like walking back through the nightmare with the lights finally on. Each sentence stripped away a layer of the confusion that had blanketed my memories. I recognized the patterns in his story. They matched the things I had whispered into my pillow in the dark, the logic I had clung to when everyone told me it didn't matter what I believed. He even mentioned the red scarf. That detail hit me the hardest. The red scarf that had been used as a timeline marker in my trial, twisted to fit their version of the truth. I had told them it wasn't mine. They didn't believe me. But he described it perfectly, the material, the way it was left behind. And yet nothing happened. That was the most unbearable part. You'd think a confession like that would set the machine of justice roaring to life, that gears would turn, judges would call emergency hearings, and doors would creak open with apology on their hinges. But nothing came. No visitors, no announcements, not even a letter. I thought about what justice meant in a place like this. It wasn't what they taught in school, all scales and blindfolds and noble oaths. It was paperwork, it was politics, it was pride, and I had no place in any of those things. The legal organization I had been corresponding with sent me a letter weeks later. They had seen the confession. They were working on a motion. They told me to be patient, that these things took time. but time was the very thing I had already given. I watched the women around me come and go. Some released quietly in the dead of night. Others returned, faces hardened or broken. I remained, with knowledge that I should not be here, and no one willing to open the gate. The worst nights were the ones where hope burned too brightly. When I imagined the warden calling me in, his face serious, holding a file marked with my name and the word exonerated printed in bold letters, I'd imagine stepping outside, feeling real air, smelling the metallic sweetness of rain on concrete, hearing a voice call my name with love instead of authority. But the mornings always came, and with them, routine, count, meals, work, the same hallway, the same faces, the same untouched bars. I began to feel like a ghost haunting my own life, floating through days with a knowledge too heavy to speak of, because each time I tried to explain it to a guard, to a social worker, even to the chaplain, I saw the same response: a polite nod, a blank expression, a mental filing cabinet slammed shut. To them, I was already categorized, a box ticked, convicted, sentenced, done, but I refused to be done. I began to write again, longer letters, more assertive. I cited the confession. I included the case number. I learned to speak their language, motion to vacate, newly discovered evidence, actual innocence standard. I became fluent in the dialect of desperation, masked as legal precision. And still, I waited. The man who confessed continued to sit in a cell not far from mine, perhaps sleeping easier now. Perhaps not. He had lifted the weight from his conscience, but mine remained, pinned by bureaucracy and indifference. Sometimes I wondered if his confession would follow me forever, like a shadow never quite catching up, proof that I had been right, and proof that being right wasn't enough. Because in this place, truth didn't scream, it didn't demand, it whispered, and unless someone with power bent down to listen, it died in silence. But I didn't let it die. I folded his confession into every letter I wrote. I etched it into my memory. I clung to it like a relic from a life I still believed in, even if I couldn't reach it yet. Because if I didn't hold on, no one would. And I had already been forgotten once, never again. I never noticed the seasons anymore. Time inside the prison didn't pass in colors, but in echoes. Shoes against concrete, keys in locks, distant murmurs from corridors that smelled like disinfectant and resignation. The calendar above my bunk faded until even the red circles I used to mark with a stub of pencil became ghosts. Time lost its shape. Days weren't days. They were just units of survival. Blinks, breaths, one less heartbeat to count. The confession had come and gone, like a ripple on the surface of a pond where nothing ever truly moved. I had imagined that confession as a detonator. I thought it would shake the very foundations of the walls holding me here. Thought it would punch through bureaucracy like lightning through a rotted tree. But the tree stood, and so did the walls. The court said they needed more time. The paperwork had to be processed. The evidence had to be reevaluated. Judges retired. Clerks lost files. Legal aid offices rotated staff. Everyone said they were sorry. Everyone said they were trying. But no one opened the door. 10 years. 10 years after that man admitted the crime I had carried like a stone on my back, I was still brushing my teeth under fluorescent lights, still sharing a toilet with a woman who had carved tally marks into her bed frame until she ran out of room, still counting down a sentence that was supposed to have ended in justice, but only deepened in cruelty. I began aging in strange ways, not in the mirror. I barely looked at myself anymore, but in my bones, in the way I moved slower without noticing, in the way I no longer flinched at the sound of steel doors slamming shut, in how I stopped expecting my name to be called for anything but roll call. Birthdays passed like smudges. My mother died and no one told me until weeks later. A cousin sent me a single card one Christmas. "We're thinking of you." But there was no return address. I had become a ghost even to the ones who used to love me. And all the while, that confession gathered dust in some file drawer labeled pending. It existed. It was real. I wasn't insane. I wasn't delusional. I had proof. But proof I had learned meant nothing without momentum. And the only people who seemed to care were too far down the ladder to make anything happen. So I waited. I read law books until the words blurred. I filed motions. I wrote letters to senators, governors, advocacy groups. Most went unanswered. Some replied with form letters, a checkbox marked, regretfully declined. I saved those too, each one a monument to a system designed not to see. I watched women leave who had done worse than I ever had. Some were gleeful, their eyes shining with freedom. Some walked out hollow, like they no longer trusted the sun. I never envied them. I didn't have the energy for envy. I simply watched and wondered if my turn would ever come. Inside, I developed rituals. I made tea from hot water and paper-thin bags rationed at canteen. I copied pages of legal opinions by hand, as if transcribing someone else's power would one day give it to me. I cleaned the same corner of the library every day, not because it needed it, but because I needed the illusion of control. And I counted, not in numbers, but in missed moments. I missed my niece's wedding. I missed my father's funeral. I missed the moment my body crossed from youth into something else, something aching and slow and irreversible. I missed the taste of fresh blueberries in June. I missed thunderstorms heard from a safe bed. I missed laughing so hard I cried. I missed my own voice unfiltered by this place. 10 years. 10 years after the truth had been spoken aloud, I was still here, waiting for a system to acknowledge me, waiting for someone to admit that not only had they been wrong once, but they had allowed the wrong to calcify for a decade. And during that decade, I became two people. There was the me that the prison saw, inmate 37104, quiet, polite, kept to herself, low risk, invisible. A model prisoner, they called me once, as if that was something to aspire to. And then there was the me who refused to vanish, the one who kept rereading the transcript of that confession, the one who clutched it like scripture, the one who still believed that one day the door would open, not because of mercy, but because I had earned it. They called what happened to me a clerical delay, a procedural misstep, a slow docket. But I called it what it was: theft. 10 years stolen not just from the outside world, but from the person I could have been, from the life I might have rebuilt, from the healing I could have started, from the identity I could have reclaimed if only the truth had mattered as much as the record. And yet I kept going, because if I stopped, if I surrendered, then the theft would be complete. Then I would not only have lost time, I would have lost myself. So I stitched those 10 years into every letter I wrote. I carried them into every parole hearing, every legal meeting, every small conversation with someone who might listen. I made them part of my breath, part of my reason, part of the fuel that burned without flame in my chest. Because one day I knew someone would ask me how I survived 10 years after being proven innocent, and I would have to look them in the eye and say, I didn't. I endured. There's a difference. It wasn't the evidence that betrayed me. It was the people who touched it. The fingerprints of arrogance and indifference smudged over everything. The reports, the photographs, the statements copied and recopied until they lost their shape. The box that held the case against me didn't smell of gunpowder or blood. It smelled of coffee stains, paper clips, and bureaucratic dust. They called it circumstantial, but in court, circumstantial wrapped around my neck like wire. I remembered how the photographs had been passed around the courtroom. Enlarged, grainy, imprecise. My coat on a chair. My car 3 blocks away. A receipt with a timestamp. A witness who thought I looked familiar. And a man on the witness stand who swore he saw someone like me near the alley where it happened. Not me, like me. That difference, small and sharp, disappeared under the weight of prosecutorial confidence. They had been so sure. And now, years later, as I sat in the prison law library, I looked again at the photographs from the trial, copies I had requested through slow, begrudging channels. The same images I had once turned away from now lay flat in front of me, underlined and labeled with my own annotations. This time, I wasn't the accused. I was the analyst, the reviewer, the only one who still gave a damn. It was winter in my bones that afternoon. The heat had gone out again in our block, and even the pages I turned felt cold. But as I went through the files line by line, the temperature rose in my chest, slow and furious. There, in the corner of one photo, a timestamp that didn't match the police report. In another, a shadow falling the wrong way, contradicting the sworn statement of the man who had testified. A third, a corner of a receipt left out of the official narrative. Tiny things, things only someone desperate would notice, things no one had wanted to see before. But I saw them now. I saw them because I had nothing left to lose by looking, and I remembered their faces. I remembered the detective, his smirk when I asked for a lawyer, his easy, practiced manner on the stand. I remembered the prosecutor, how she clicked her pen during objections, how she pointed at me with her whole hand. I remembered the judge, a man with liver spots and a mind that had already decided I was guilty before the opening statement. And I remembered the jurors, ordinary people. They had watched me cry. They had watched me tremble. And in their eyes, I had seen something colder than doubt. I had seen relief. Relief that it was me on that bench and not them. Relief that justice had a face they didn't recognize. Relief that the nightmare had a conclusion they could swallow in one verdict. They had gone home. I had not. I often wondered if they even remembered my name. I wondered if they remembered the forensic analyst who had stood so confidently and said the blood on the coat could reasonably be from the victim. But no DNA match was ever proven. I knew that now because I had forced the prison's clinic to give me a copy of the report. The results had been inconclusive, but they'd never said that in court. They let implication do the rest. There had been no murder weapon with my fingerprints, no surveillance footage, no confession, no motive, only a narrative stitched together from shadows and suggestion. And that had been enough. Now I stared at the reports, yellowed and brittle, and wondered how many others had fallen under the same weight. How many others were still buried in files marked closed? How many faces like mine had been locked away, not because of what they had done, but because someone needed the case to end? The more I read, the more I saw how flawed the architecture had been. The report from the scene had listed a time of death based on lividity that contradicted the medical examiner's own testimony. That discrepancy had been brushed off at trial, but I knew now it mattered. I wrote it down, circled it. I filed it under inconsistencies they ignored. Another document showed the forensic team hadn't processed a key footprint found near the scene because it didn't match the suspect's shoe size. It had been excluded, buried. They never explained why that mattered. They never wondered whose shoe it was. The heat in my body began to climb. A dull throb formed behind my temples. I wasn't just reading, I was reliving. I could feel the courtroom again, the dryness in my mouth, the hard edge of the chair beneath me, the murmur of the gallery, the deliberate way the prosecutor had said my full name like a curse. They had framed the story so well. They made it easy to believe. Single woman, no alibi. A quiet loner who had once argued with the victim over a parking spot. That was enough. That was character. That was motive. But now the cracks showed, and as I stared at the man's confession, typed, signed, time-stamped, I realized how long the truth had been waiting to be noticed. 10 years ago, he had walked into a police station and admitted it all. He even provided details that hadn't been released publicly. They logged his statement, they filed it, and then they forgot it. No one had linked it to my case, or maybe they had, and ignored it. The system doesn't like to admit its mistakes. It doesn't know how to say, "We got it wrong." It prefers the illusion of infallibility. And when faced with the truth, it buries it in process, in language, in delay. But I had learned how to read their language, and I had the patience of someone who had been forgotten. So I compiled my findings. I wrote a new appeal, using their own words against them. I cited every line, every omission, every contradiction. And when I finished, I knew it would likely sit on a desk for weeks, months, maybe longer, but it was real. It existed. And I sent it not just to the courts, but to the press, to legal clinics, to universities, to anyone who might listen, because I had stopped hoping that the truth alone would be enough. Now I needed witnesses, not to the crime, but to the failure that followed. The day they told me I could go, I didn't cry. I didn't smile either. The word release sounded like a strange shape in the mouth of the woman who handed me the paper. It felt foreign, like a passport to a country that no longer recognized me. The air around her smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee. I looked at the page, then at my hands, and realized they were shaking, not from fear, not from joy, but from absence. The kind of absence that grows when something has been taken from you for too long and suddenly returned, like light after blindness. I stood in the same clothes I had worn when they arrested me. The jeans were too tight now, the collar of my shirt too wide around a neck that had thinned with time. I had aged into someone I didn't fully know. My hair, once black and long, had been cut close for years, the gray like frost over a fire long extinguished. My reflection in the hallway mirror stopped me, not because I looked broken, but because I didn't. I didn't carry a suitcase. I left with a manila envelope holding court documents and a bus voucher. No one waited for me outside the gates. No hand on my shoulder. No voice calling my name. Just the hum of traffic on the interstate and the distant bark of a dog. I walked slowly, each step deliberate, like I was stepping into a world that had grown without me, branched off into a new shape, while I remained trapped in a loop of silence and fluorescent lights. The bus stop was a bench beside a field gone to weeds. I sat down, feeling the cold metal seep into my skin. A teenager nearby scrolled on his phone, never once looking at me. The driver didn't greet me either. I took a window seat, and for 2 hours I watched the world blur past. Fast food signs, outlet malls, digital billboards glowing with offers and faces I didn't recognize. The pace of it all made my heart feel slow. Freedom didn't come with a ceremony. It came with a plastic bag of belongings, a stiff seat, and silence. When I arrived in the city, the noise was unbearable. People moved as if chased, eyes down, voices clipped and cold. Screens were everywhere, on wrists, on street corners, in windows. No one noticed anyone. I hadn't expected a parade, but I had imagined someone might meet my eyes. They didn't. I went to the halfway house they assigned me. A woman behind bulletproof glass asked for my ID, then handed me a sheet with rules typed in bold letters. I nodded, signed, and followed her pointing finger to a narrow room with a cot, a window sealed shut, and a small desk bolted to the floor. The radiator clanked all night. The sheets smelled like bleach and mildew. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my hands again. They were steadier now, but I still didn't know what to do with them. They had taught us to follow orders, to wait for announcements, to keep our heads down. Out here, no one told me what time to eat, when to sleep, or where to go. I had forgotten how to make decisions. My freedom tasted more like confusion than relief. I took my first steps outside with a backpack and no destination. The city pulsed around me, cars honking, children crying, advertisements screaming promises in fonts too large to ignore. I passed by women my age, pushing strollers, walking dogs, talking on phones. I passed by men in suits, in uniforms, in sagging jeans. No one knew who I was, and yet I felt like they all could tell. I stepped into a corner store to buy a toothbrush. The clerk asked me something about a rewards program, and I just blinked. She sighed and scanned my item without waiting. I realized then how out of sync I was. The world had moved on, and I was still learning how to operate a microwave. When I got back to the halfway house, a woman 2 doors down knocked and left a pair of socks and a sticky note that said, "You don't have to explain anything." I sat with that note for hours. It was the kindest thing I'd seen in years. But kindness didn't erase the years, or the bitterness. It didn't erase the parole check-ins, the job rejections, the way people flinched when they saw felon on the form. It didn't erase the fact that I had missed birthdays, funerals, entire seasons of my own life. One afternoon, I went to the library. It was the one place that felt unchanged. Rows of books, the smell of paper and dust, a silence that felt sacred instead of oppressive. I found myself walking the aisles without knowing what I was looking for. Eventually, I sat in the law section. My fingers found the volumes I used to study by moonlight through a prison window. I pulled one down, opened it to a random page, and read the first line I saw. Justice delayed is justice denied. I closed the book and held it to my chest. Later that night, I wrote in my notebook, not about revenge, not about regret, but about the space in between, where grief and resilience coexist. I didn't want to fight anymore, but I didn't want to forget either. The world outside wasn't cruel, it was indifferent, and maybe that was worse. In prison, at least I had a number, a role, a schedule. Outside, I was invisible unless I made noise. So I began to write letters. Letters to lawmakers, to journalists, to people who had written books about wrongful convictions. Not to beg, but to bear witness. I told my story again and again, shaping it into something that might one day protect someone else from the same erasure. Some nights I sat by the window and watched the sky. The stars looked the same. The moon hadn't changed. That comforted me, because the moon had watched me through bars and through glass. It had waited, and now I waited too, not for closure, but for understanding, not from the world, but from myself. Inside, I had learned how to survive. Outside, I was learning how to live. And that, I realized, would take even more strength.